My name is Adam Sterling with Berkeley Law, and it is a pleasure to be joined by all of you. We're going to dive into frontier technologies in art. We'll look at AI. We'll dive in a bit deeper into NFTs, cover some of the legal issues. Before we do, I want to ask that you join me in giving a big round of applause. I don't see her, but there she is, Delia Violante. Who I want to say has been working on this program for close to 5 years, art, finance, and the law, and had this idea for a program prior to the pandemic. So it's really incredible, and I'm so proud to see it come to fruition today. So Delia, thanks for your leadership here. Now, for folks that may have felt a bit lost in the last session, that is okay, because we have quite a treat today. My colleague, Professor Sonia Katyal, is going to kick things off. We have a bit of a lecture highlighting NFTs, their use in art, some of the intellectual property issues. Then I'll be joined by our other guests. We'll dig even a bit deeper and have some fun. So Sonia, take it away.
Great, thanks so much. It's so nice to be here in person, and I just really want to thank the organizers and also everyone at Berkeley. I'm going to talk a little bit about the confluence of like 3 different moments, and I'm going to go full-on law professor and give you guys a bit of a primer on some of the legal issues. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the rise of NFTs, then we're going to talk about the role of copyright and increasingly trademark law. And then we're going to touch a little bit on kind of the questions of how the metaverse interacts with these kinds of areas. There are a couple of areas that I'm not going to talk about with respect to NFTs, but that obviously deserve mention, particularly given the panel that we just heard from, issues of securities, banking regulation, and also really significantly issues of environmental sustainability, which I think are at the heart of some of the questions around ethics. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I'm assuming that a lot of people are familiar with this, but in case not, NFT stands for the term non-fungible token. It's a digital asset that's considered to be unique by the nature of its technology. So in contrast to fungible assets that can be exchangeable, an NFT is essentially unique. It's one of a kind. It's a code that sits on the blockchain and that represents an asset. There's a bunch of different aspects associated with this. There's a number that identifies the NFT, an address that identifies the owner, and then a URL that essentially links to the underlying asset. And the reason why we call it non-fungible is because it's unique and cannot be substituted for something that is equivalent. Where do they reside? They reside in digital wallets. The most popular cryptocurrency is Ethereum. And NFT marketplaces, which obviously we'll talk more about, essentially allow users to create their own NFTs. But as we talked about in the previous panel, the value of them is really reputation driven. It depends on the marketplace. NFTs have been around for a while, but obviously they've taken off very recently. And just to give you a sense of the scale, the market for NFTs was $27 billion, whereas the market for global streaming music rights, less than $20 billion in the same year. So really significant, and something that I think many lawyers and individuals that are interested in creating value in any marketplace should be thinking about. But the question that I think is the most kind of complex is how NFTs relate to existing theories of law, and particularly because I'm an IP professor, particularly thinking about how they relate to intellectual property. So as was mentioned earlier, an NFT creator basically includes a link to a digital file that can contain a copy of the work, an article of visual art, a musical work, whatever the NFT comprises. But here's the thing that's really important. Buying an NFT does not include the sale of the underlying content or the copyright protection that the work enjoys. It depends, essentially. So the sale involves a virtual token and really turns on the license that accompanies the token that determines the owner's scope of the rights and limitations that are associated with the work. Now, what's significant about NFTs, particularly from an artist's perspective, is that they recognize a new new right of the creator, essentially, to resale royalties. And this is something that does not exist under copyright law, and in fact has been rejected a bunch of times by Congress. And also at the same time, this right is also recognized as a license and not a sale of the underlying work. So this raises a really interesting question, which is whether or not NFTs are kind of new things in and of themselves, or how they map onto pre-existing principles of copyright and trademark. Now, as was mentioned in the previous panel, the blockchain is essentially immutable, so NFTs and any resulting transactions or transfers cannot be deleted or altered, and this is where the provenance question comes into play. So it's a lot easier to trace the buying and selling and trading of digital works of art. They cannot be lost, destroyed. There's an interesting question about whether or not they can be stolen, which just emerged regarding the artist and creator Seth Green, who just lost one of his NFTs. But as I would argue, I think the thing that's really interesting about NFTs is that they raise this fundamental question about what the reach of public law and regulation is over this new emerging world that is essentially very much contract-driven. And so the question of how IP rights govern these kind of privatized worlds is really essentially at the heart of, I think, one of the more difficult areas of complexity. Now, some law professors, like Edward Lee in particular, has argued that they're entirely new forms of property, right? They're created by computer code rather than regulation. Let's take a look a little bit of some different. Sorry, this is not.
Next slide.
Could we go to the next? Oh, great. Okay, perfect. There we go. Okay. What are some use cases? Well, we can see NFTs emerging in a bunch of different areas. In gaming, in online games where people sell and exchange different commodities. In art, as we spoke about, establishing ownership of digital art. There's a fractionalization associated with that. Collectibles, like digital collectibles, baseball cards, and virtual assets as well. Crypto domains and other things relating to the metaverse and virtual reality. Here are some. Could we go to the next slide, please? Great. Let's talk a little bit about some well-known NFT projects. The CryptoKitties, a video game where users can breed and collect NFT cats. CryptoPunks, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. Digital art collectibles that have a very similar style. There's Axie Infinity, a virtual game. There's OpenSea, a marketplace where users can buy and sell their own NFTs. And then obviously as it relates to sports, NBA Top Shot, which involves types of NFTs that essentially tokenize NBA highlights. Could we go to the next slide, please? And the thing that's significant about NFTs is this kind of unencumbered possibility of commercialization. So one digital asset can be linked to essentially a finite number of NFTs. Artists can sell paintings to one person, but they can actually create an NFT that's linked to a photograph of the painting to another. And so again, this kind of development of multiple revenue streams is what's significant. You can also fractionalize ownership, as we talked about in the previous panel, of the underlying asset, so that multiple buyers can benefit proportionally to the amount that they own. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the other thing that's significant about NFTs is the role of contract law. So NFT's code essentially forms a smart contract that's stored on the blockchain. It can include a bunch of other aspects, descriptions of the NFTs, traits, financial terms, specific rights. This is where the license comes into play. Again, as I mentioned earlier, resale royalty rights. So every time a transaction occurs, the original creator can receive a portion of the royalties. Next slide, please. But here is the conflict. So some experts argue that smart contracts essentially replace existing legal contracts for transactions and licensing agreements. And because the blockchain can be autonomously enforced, right, it often is more effective than things like copyrights, licensing systems, and resale royalties. But other people and other professors disagree, and they say that because a smart contract is permanently on the blockchain, there could be future problems that emerge from questions of wanting to change the contract terms, if there's a change in IP protection. And so this question of how the law sits aside these contracts is really significant. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now let's talk a little bit about copyright law. So the underlying work of an NFT can depict an existing work, but it can also be considered an infringing copy, derivative rights, a derivative work, in infringing distribution or a public performance. And so that raises the question again of how intellectual property protections map onto NFTs. Let's go to the next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about some complexity with respect to some very well-known NFT projects. So CryptoPunks and the Bored Ape Yacht Club NFTs have actually spawned, and this is really interesting from an IP perspective, they've spawned a number of clones, copyrights, copycats, alternative visions, derivatives. But here's the interesting thing. The terms of the license, right, the owners of the NFTs are not actually discouraging these derivatives. So even the Bored Ape license allows owners of the NFTs to create derivative works. CryptoKitties can sell merchandise as long as they don't make over $100,000. And this raises, again, this question of like IP versus these smart contracts. Now, OpenSea has tended to deal with this by removing versions that are very similar to the existing NFTs, so ones that are flipped or mirrored. But in the past, when copyright notices have been sent to OpenSea objecting to these kind of flipped versions, there's been a backlash from the community that has essentially argued that NFTs are an entirely new form of property and that they should include the following right to create derivative works, which is something that CryptoPunks and the Bored Ape Yacht Club has done. And so one person who sold their NFT argued, if you don't assign the token and the image the same rights, what's the point of binding them together eternally on the blockchain? So again, this question of like what happens to these bundles of rights is really at the heart of some of the more interesting issues. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then to show you kind of the sort of opposing view from the idea that NFTs represent an entirely new world are an emerging series of cases that stem from the question of how trademark rights attach to NFTs. So in contrast to this kind of new form of property approach, trademark issues can arise when an NFT uses a third party's trademark. So companies like Nike and Birkin are involved in trademark lawsuits against retailers. So in one example, you have retailer StockX that's selling NFTs of Nike sneakers as NFTs, and a buyer can actually, interestingly, exchange the NFT for the physical sneaker or trade and sell the NFT for other NFTs or cryptocurrency. And Nike has sued, arguing essentially that these vault NFTs are going to confuse customers and that they're using their trademark. Next slide, please. Very similarly, Hermès recently sued an artist named Mason Rothschild for creating what's known of as a MetaBirkin NFT, arguing that the NFT is going to create consumer confusion. Now, Hermès does not have trademarks in digital versions of its leather goods at the time that it filed. So Rothschild essentially argued that his use of the trademark Birkin is essentially social commentary that was protected by the First Amendment freedom of expression. And he argues this because his NFTs depict Birkin bags clad in fur, and has argued that the NFTs are nothing more than meaning, and that they actually are a vehicle for commentary on the animal cruelty that is associated with Hermès' manufacture of its bags. Now, the most recent district court to deal with this has rejected this view. And I found it very interesting that I found a video of the artist talking about the need for counterfeit protection over his MetaBirkin bags. And he was like, some people will pay $40,000 for these MetaBirkins and they don't realize that they're buying counterfeits. And I just thought that was interesting. Let's go to the next slide. So another kind of interesting artistic issue involves NFTs and moral rights. So in the US, moral rights are slightly more narrower than they are in other countries. They protect the right of attribution and the right of integrity, which protects against intentional distortion or mutilation of an underlying work of art. Recently, a Banksy work was burnt with an NFT recording the event, raising this interesting question of whether an NFT that memorializes and publicizes a violation of moral rights, whether or not that actually infringes on the artist's moral rights. So interesting issues for people to kind of think about. Now, before we wrap up, I also just want to say a couple of words about another big IP issue. Could we go to the next slide? Which involves copyright and AI. We're sort of switching gears a little bit here. And here, the sort of interesting question involves how copyright law attaches to generative AI, so computer-generated works and the like. And the link, obviously, between this topic and the previous one involves this question of, like, what do we do with all these new technologies? So with AI-generated art, the Copyright Office has ruled that copyright law only protects the fruits of intellectual labor that are founded in the creative powers of the mind. And if we could go to the next slide. So in this particular instance, the Copyright Office rejected copyright for a work. I'm sorry that you can't see it that well with the slide, but it's essentially part of a series that was generated by AI, simulating a near-death experience where an algorithm reprocesses pictures to create kind of an image and a fictional narrative about the afterlife. And the AI essentially does this with very minimal human intervention. But the courts and Copyright Office have rejected the idea that this is subject to copyright protection. And if we could go to the next slide. And this is what the Copyright Office has said in the past: works that are produced by a machine or mere mechanical process without any creative input or intervention from a human author are not registrable. So the question is whether or not something that is produced by humans, with the computer being something that assists the human, or whether the traditional elements of authorship were actually conceived of and executed by man or machine. And this, I think, is a real sort of interesting tangle, because we have a world, and if we could go to the next slide, we have a world where computer-generated works are essentially everywhere across the internet. So OpenAI just developed a system that actually generates images from natural language descriptions. So you can have a description like this: a painting of a fox sitting in a field at sunrise in the style of Claude Monet. And this is the resulting process, right? The resulting product. Next slide. So last, I just think it's useful to ask whether or not these issues represent something that is a truly new form of intellectual property, or whether we are opening the door for a contract-driven world that essentially opens the door to even more restrictive licensing. And these questions, I think, are going to be more and more important as we confront the advent of the metaverse, right? Because it enables an even greater collection of content. And I think it also just kind of introduces this question of how we should be creative about ownership, right? Are we entering into a world where there's a kind of partiality associated with copyright, authorship, and even ownership? Or whether what we're seeing is kind of a hybrid economy of human and machine-driven creativity that requires us to find new answers to these questions. And so these are some of the issues that I hope our panelists will be able to confront. Next slide. And last but not least, I'm quoting a dear friend of mine, Trevor Paglen, who has written about some of these issues. And what he's basically said is something dramatic has happened to the world of images. They've become detached from human eyes. I call this the world of machine-to-machine image making, invisible images, because it's a form of vision that is inaccessible to human eyes. And this is the question that I would end on. Have we created a world of singularity where essentially machines are driving the very creative forces that we value in humanity? Thanks so much.
So, Sonia, I'm going to ask you to join us. And can we go back 2 slides to the open questions? There we are. Great. So I want to welcome our other panelists, Nick Brown of SuperRare Labs, Simon Frankel of Covington and Berkeley, who co-teaches with our host, Adine, Art Law. So Simon is our practitioner, our legal practitioner on the panel. I'm going to actually allow you to see if you want to address any of these concluding questions.
Yeah, so I come at this as a practitioner. We try to solve clients' problems, so it's a slightly different perspective, perhaps. And I mean, my main answer to this is mostly, for lack of a better phrase, old wine in new bottles to me. These are copyright and trademark issues, maybe perhaps patent as well, that we've confronted before, for the most part. Just as an example, it's always been the rule, it's developed in some years, that there has to be a human author for a work to have copyright protection and be eligible for registration. That's a difficult issue that's going to be, it's an old rule, it's been applied broadly, it keeps being applied in this new world of AI, but it's going to be applied, it's either going to be changed or it's going to apply. It's not like it's a new problem. It's just a more difficult problem because there's a lot more creativity coming out now. I think a lot of the trademark issues that Sonia covered are really just the same questions. Is, you know, if StockX is selling NFTs that allow access to or redemption for Nike shoes, is that, and they're using Nike's trademark in marketing those NFTs, is that a trademark infringement? Does it create confusion as to the source of the goods or services? There's an added issue in that case because I believe Nike's now claiming that not only is StockX using Nike's trademark to promote the NFTs giving access to Nike shoes, but some of the Nike shoes are not actually authentic Nike shoes. It's an old problem. It's in a new context. Similarly to me, a lot of the questions about access to NFT, a lot of the questions about NFTs are really questions we've been grappling with for 25 years in the digital world. You've got a digital asset. Now there's new access to it. There's new controls on it. It's different because you can't just right-click on an image on the internet. Someone has unique access to it. But issues of whether it's infringing someone else's copyright, well, there's a new issue because maybe no one else can access it, so the copyright owner won't know that their work was infringed. We've seen that before, but that may be a particular problem with NFTs. I do think the resale royalty issue is a real, it's not a new issue, because going back to the 1970s, many of you will know there were efforts to contract into resale royalties. Artists would sell their work subject to a contract that would say, when you sell it, you will pay me 5% of the sale price, and you will get the next buyer to agree to this contract, and they'll do the same thing, but there are obviously enforcement problems. This technology solves the enforcement problems. Everyone has notice of the contract, and they cannot buy the NFT without agreeing to those terms, and it's even mechanically done, as Sonia said. So, to me, there are some difficult issues here, but we're playing with the same rules, just like 10, 15, when was it we spent a lot of time talking about Second Life and how it was going to change all the rules of copyright and trademark? And we got through that, and they were the same rules. So I'm not poo-pooing it, I'm just saying it's like a much bigger Second Life.
It's sad to think that saying Second Life like now is something that ages us, because that was the metaverse before there was a metaverse. So it's interesting, and I tend to agree. As someone that has looked at this extensively from a securities law perspective, I think the traditional rules actually do apply remarkably well. Apologies to the last panel, but I think Howie does apply to NFTs and crypto digital assets quite well. But I want to dive in and ask, does the technology, or will it evolve to a point where we do have to rethink some of those rules? And to help us think about the technology, I want to welcome Nick, who is an engineer and works on the technology side of things. So Nick, tell us a bit about what you're doing at SuperRare, and then you also, as part of this panel, have kind of agreed to talk about some of the uses of frontier technology elsewhere, AI. I know you've looked into the OpenAI, DALL-E program, but I'll turn it over to you. Give us a little bit of a taste of how advanced the technology is becoming.
Certainly. Thank you for having me. Yeah, so for a little bit of background, I work at SuperRare Labs, and we have 2 primary focuses. One of them is the SuperRare platform, which is an NFT marketplace specializing in one-of-one NFTs or crypto artworks. I say one-of-one to differentiate from some of the projects we just saw, like CryptoPunks and Bored Ape Yacht Club, where you may own one of 10,000 of those. So focusing on more what we think is the more artistic side, rather than these large series that are oftentimes used more as crowdfunding campaigns or purchased access to a specific community rather than truly just an interest in the art itself. The second focus for SuperRare is the SuperRare network, where we are building a premium kind of curation and discovery layer on top of the wider digital and crypto art markets. So affording collectors the opportunity to kind of help discover the next generation of artists, help promote them, help draw attention to them through some various models. So kind of building on that, before I came to SuperRare, I was building kind of AI-driven products across the healthcare and voice data industries for about 10 years. So I kind of arrive at this intersection of technology and art at a very interesting and exciting time. And to kind of get back to the questions and kind of what technology is doing here, I also tend to agree with most of what I've heard so far today, in that we have a lot of laws that are almost all the way there, maybe some addendums needed to cover these new situations, but ultimately we can fall back and look at previous examples. I appreciate you bringing up, where the human element comes in, because that's where I think there's a lot of trickiness in there. AI in particular has kind of three big components we can think about. One of it is the code that embodies the AI itself. The second is, the data used to train the AI. And then the last, as we saw with the, DALL-E is the name of that OpenAI project that produced that kind of fox in the style of Monet. There's the end user input. I want this fox in this style, in this field of green. And so with those three separate components, you have human input at each of those stages, whether, who owns that at the end of the day? Is it the artists who produced the work the AI were trained on, the engineers that built the code or wrote the code itself, or that very end user who came in and provided 2 sentences of text that ultimately caused that AI to render that image? So
Can we go back to I think it's 2 slides back?
Yeah.
Sonia? Yeah, there it
you
is.
go.
Okay.
Exactly, thank you. And yeah, this is where I think it gets really interesting. So I would say that yes, we fall back on those existing rules, but where we're kind of pulling back the rug on a lot of nuance of what the human element here is and how far that humanity goes. There's some lovely. Go ahead.
So help me just with this technology. So OpenAI, it's a private company.
Correct.
They own arguably the technology that's being deployed here.
That's correct.
And then as a user, I can go and provide this input, a painting of a fox sitting in a field at sunrise in the style of Claude Monet, and then the technology, the AI, produces this image.
Yes, not only this, but you could ask for dozens of variations based on that exact same input and get dozens of different versions of it.
And if I ask the same question, a painting of a fox sitting, et cetera, would I get the same image or might I get a different image the next time?
It's certainly possible that you would get one of the same images, but it is rendering these things on the fly. It's producing these works on the fly. That gets to the complexity of each individual AI, but there would be no guarantee at all that this is the exact image that it would spit out. In fact, I would be surprised if it spit out that one reliably.
Yeah, and there have been cases about forms of AI and what comes out of them, and the courts have said if the output is determined by human choices, then it can be protected by copyright, and if not, not. And I would just say this is one where we have a rule, it gives us answers, but it might, over time, we might decide it's not the right answer, because as more and more is generated by AI, there may be some right that ought to be granted.
Yeah, and Sonia, how do you see this evolving, and how does it, what's your view on where we're at with our rules and regulations? And I'll let you kind of, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that I don't actually disagree with Simon's point about the applicability of rules to these situations. I think what's so interesting about this, from my perspective, is if you take a step back, the standard of originality and creativity in copyright is extremely low, right, for something to be copyrightable. And yet, if we look at kind of what the Copyright Office has said about AI-driven creativity, even at a very high level of creative output, it's refusing to grant recognition because of this issue of kind of what's driving the productivity or the product. Is it the author or is it the machine? And that, I think, is an interesting kind of outlying sort of field where you have enormous kind of creativity and generativity in AI that is really not recognized by the law. And then you also have the increasing commoditization of these products that I think has opened this whole new world of the marketplace. And so questions of kind of what we use to protect those interests, if it's not copyright, raises a lot of wrinkles. And just to kind of add one more to it, I am really concerned. I'm somebody that came into IP because I was really inspired by things like the open source movement, like I'm sure some of you were, and by the idea that this was kind of a new world where we had new rules and new possibilities. I am concerned about the fact that we're letting everything being driven by contract law in the NFT context, because I do think that one of the values of copyright law, even if it's been much maligned, is the protection of fair use. And I think that becomes entirely foreclosed on the blockchain.
Simon, did you want to?
No, I think that's the point about it is interesting to think. I mean, the amount of creativity that goes into, if I hold my iPhone up to take a picture of you all, and earlier today my kid played with the settings, so I didn't even choose the settings, and I just hold up, the Copyright Office say, total copyright protection. I would say no creativity, and yet you have all this creativity going into the AI, and yet we don't give protection. It is a paradox, I think. Fair use, that's another topic.
Nick, where's the technology going? Is it the kind of Terminator style that DALL-E is going to be just making this art on its own without the prompting? What do you see? What's next?
I think it's a very branching road from here, so not a straight and narrow path. But what you said is absolutely true. Getting to a point where we're already seeing NFTs, artworks that are responding, have some AI components in them, and they are evolving artworks over time. As a collector, you may love that or you may hate that. Not unlike the Banksy work that was shredded the minute it closed at auction. We will absolutely see more projects like DALL-E 2. And again, it raises this question of, is this just the most advanced paintbrush that we've seen to date? Photoshop became that in many ways for a lot of people, and we still consider works that are produced with Photoshop owned by that artist. Am I now an artist because I put in 12 words and outspit a masterpiece that people were willing to pay for? So certainly many projects like this to come with much more complex input than just text or just one other image. I think really just getting to that point of raising the human component and the human layer of abstraction in thinking. It's the old, does the conductor create music if they're conducting the orchestra? I would say yes, even though they haven't played any one of the individual notes. And here again, in this case, in the same way that digital mediums like Photoshop took the many artists out of the tactical decisions of drawing a perfect circle or drawing a straight line, so too a tool like this can help artists think at a higher level and create all new sorts of works, maybe more rapidly than ever before.
I suppose there's a possibility that NFTs will allow artists to limit access to their works obtaining through through their works created by AI, allowing them to protect from copying the works that would not otherwise be protected by copyright. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I could easily see a world that opens the door to even greater control, definitely.
So I interested in the promise of a lot of this technology, but I would like if we can maybe think a bit about how it's being deployed or how it's been deployed over the past few years. And we started the day off, I think, with Lance, our critic, talking about art being involved and created by a human. And then later on, we heard on a panel, I think one of the quotes from our friend from an investment bank was about, well, you need to take the emotion out of art, which is something I don't know if we want to be doing. And where I have pause is, watching the Super Bowl this year and seeing the amount of commercials around cryptocurrencies and NFTs, and looking at some of the prices of the Bored Apes and Top Shots. And it's hard for me to say that that's not driven more by speculation than any sort of underlying utility or connection to the underlying asset. And so I guess any thoughts or comments on kind of how this is being deployed and from a consumer angle, or just, I'll leave that there, but I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts.
Certainly. Obviously, plenty of opinions about this one, but I would say similar to any new shiny technology, there's this tendency to want to apply this new fun hammer to everything out there. Everything starts to look like a nail. And so certainly we have an over-application of this in the case of blockchain and NFTs a bit as well. Certainly plenty would argue with me. I think we tend to see these ebbs and flows a little bit. We saw it with, the .com kind of boom and bust. Clearly, the internet recovered from that and is doing just fine. We've seen it with some other trends with big data that gave rise to AI. And certainly, we're still seeing it with AI, where AI became kind of a hot buzzword, was maybe a little over-applied to anything and everything, and then has started to retreat just a little bit back into those better sets of use cases. And we'll probably see that with NFTs as well, and the blockchain in general. Currently, you can't go anywhere on the internet without saying, hey, let's put this on a blockchain. Is that a good idea? Probably not in every use case. But I think we will find firmer ground and map our use cases correctly to the technology.
Very cool. Sonia, I know you think a lot about policy, and you're involved with a lot of folks that do. Just maybe share with the room, where are we headed as far as thinking about this as a country, as even more broadly?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that the market will eventually kind of correct itself, and the kind of excitement and the idea that everyone needs to create an NFT and everything will probably subside. But I think ultimately, I'm really drawn to these kinds of questions as someone who loves art, right? And my love of art doesn't come from the fact that art can now be and serves as a commodity. And so I think that, there was an article that came out recently from the New York Times where it talked about how in recent auctions, the idea of pricing is really driven by speculation and hype. I think that was like the title actually of the article. And there was a section in the article that talked about how, there is a danger in us commodifying and focusing so much on these kinds of market-driven creations, because I do think that on some level, it really raises the question of what the function of art is. And I think if you speak to artists or you speak to collectors or investors, they're very different views on what the function of art is. And I think that, that's the world that we're confronted with, is the increasing commodification of art has really changed the stakes in answering that question.
Well, given where we started, I think that's a beautiful way to end this session. We're going to go to break, so if you have questions, you can try to find us as we go. I want to thank each and every one of you. This was fascinating for me, and I hope it was for all of you. And I believe we are close to the conclusion of the day, but I hope everyone gets to stay to see the museum and more. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll return. Thank you.